On May the 6th, King Charles III, I find it, I confess, still difficult not to refer to him as Prince Charles, but we will learn, will be crowned king. It's an extraordinary thought, but it's a ceremony in its essence, which is even older than the Norman Conquest. It goes back, and I've just done a film there, I've just done some filming there, rather. It goes back to Bath Abbey in 973, to the reign of King Alfred's great-grandson, King Edgar. And why Bath? And incidentally, the Bishop of Bath and Wells will be on one side of the king, actually at the coronation, still commemorating this fact, that the first coronation was there. Well, it is because the man being crowned king wasn't only king of England, he probably had a coronation as king of England, we're not quite sure, but he had established something that didn't exist again really until, dare I mention, in a talk on coronations, dare I mention the word Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell, remember, is the only person ever to have conquered the whole of the British Isles. He is by far our greatest and probably nastiest domestic general, but certainly the most effective. But anyway, Edgar had established an hegemony over the whole of the British Isles, and the coronation in Bath, it was a mixture of a Christian service in the abbey, devised by St. Dunstan, the Archbishop of Canterbury, but also, many of you will have been to Bath, what's the abbey next to? The Roman baths. And the Roman baths then would almost certainly have still been a bit like the baths of Caracalla, they'd have still had the roof. So it's between Christianity and the memory of imperial Rome, the greatness of imperial Rome. And this is an imperial coronation. And it is a coronation which sets the model for virtually every other European monarchy as well as our own. And there are the three key elements. There's first of all the element of acclamation. Remember, monarchs were originally elected or quasi-elected military leaders. So as you'll see at the beginning of the coronation, the Archbishop of Canterbury will go to the by the way, what is that stage? I'm standing on a stage now. What is the stage in the abbey called? The theatre. That is actually the technical name for it. And Westminster Abbey is built deliberately for this purpose, with this hugely wide area of the crossing. So you've got the nave there, you've got the two transepts there, and you've got the enormous choir behind, and we'll talk about who's in the choir and why he's there and what effects that has on the coronation shortly. So you've got then the theatre, and at each corner of the stage on May the 6th, the Archbishop will stand and ask, will you have this man to be your king? And there'll be the cry from the little boys of Westminster Abbey, now of course girls, we must not forget this, the vivat, vivat rex, long live the king, long live the king. And that was the first element. Then there's something that we've forgotten, and it seems to me to be absolutely central, and I think far too much emphasis is being placed on the other. Yes, the coronation is a religious service. The service that took place was devised by St. Dunstan, and not only is it imperial Rome, it's Christianity, but it's Old Testament Christianity. The great anthem we all remember for the coronation, one of the greatest pieces of ceremonial music ever written, is Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet, anointed Solomon king. And in other words, the whole notion of monarchy in England as monarchy throughout Western Europe goes back beyond Rome. Rome did not have kings. It goes back beyond Rome to the Old Testament, to the kings of the Jews, and to the anointing of the kings of the Jews by Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet. And the anointing then takes place, and this is again the highlight of the ceremony. So there is the sense of which King Charles, which the Archbishop of Canterbury, heaven help us, and him, has been making a great deal of, the idea of the service as consecration, the holy bit of the service. But the one I'm more interested in, because I'm a political historian, is that the coronation is a contract. It begins with that ceremony of acclamation. Will you have this man to be your king? And then there are the swearing of oaths. And those oaths are political. They're about how you're going to govern. The first oath you swear is to keep the peace, or used to be, Edgar, keep the peace between church and people. The great tension, oddly enough, in Christian society. The second one was to do justice in mercy and in truth. That is still one of the central points of the coronation oath. And the third one, which we've now forgotten, remember, this is the Dark Ages we're talking about after all, was to suppress rapacity and iniquity. If only we had a similar coronation oath nowadays, Boris would be quaking in his boots, you know, especially about the iniquity bit. Probably George Osborne would be trembling at the rapacity. Anyway, so you swear, I said, you swear a traditional coronation oath, which is the beginning of the idea of contract, and then you have this magnificent service in which, first of all, you're anointed. And again, we need to understand the nature of that anointing. It is the only moment of the service, which, again, like the coronation service of Queen Elizabeth II, we will not see. Why will we not see it? Because what you will see is the monarch's flesh. That in the Middle Ages, the monarch would have been stripped and lying prone before the altar, as oils are, in those days it's always a hymn, as oils are poured onto the shoulder blades, the breast, the inside of the arms there, the palms of the hand, and the head. It's an extraordinary process. And you can imagine for Victoria, there was a profound doubt about doing this. And the whole thing was very heavily edited down. And Victoria's diary, which otherwise records the thing in fulsome detail, falls slightly silent at this point. But or maybe again it's because it's censored by her daughter, who edits her papers. Anyway, so there is that process of anointing. So this idea, this form of coronation, and it's written down, so it's available for transmission, becomes the basis of what happens. Now, within 100 years of that, well, less than 100 years, 90 years of that, the Anglo-Saxon monarchy of England collapses with the Norman Conquest. It's very important we understand, ladies and gentlemen, the nature of the Norman Conquest. Far too often, it's represented as a kind of year in Provence with a little added violence. It was not. We were a subject people. It's a conquest which is so radical that it changes the centers of population. It changes where bishoprics are cited. It changes the language we speak. Remember, the language we speak is this extraordinary amalgam of what was left of a Germanic tongue fused with French and Latin and Greek. It's why you cannot have a notion of pure English. It's why we don't have an English academy. There can be no such thing if you have this and remember, English is an extraordinarily modern language. It doesn't even begin to assume its current form until the end of the 14th century, until Chaucer. And that's all the result of the Norman Conquest. What the Norman Conquest leaves you with is a country that speaks three languages. We know what they are. The invaders speak French, the clergy speak Latin, and the peasants grunt. We actually have a record of the grunts from the Battle of Hastings. We know, the Bayeux Tapestry and whatever. We know exactly what it was. The war cry of the invading knights, of the Norman knights. French had settled down much, much earlier as a language. We can understand it. It's Dieu aide, God help us. Indeed, it was God help the English. And then the battle cry of the housecarls, of those people bearing the great battle axes around King Alfred Godwinson, was oot, 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 out, 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 just like Arthur Scargill's miners. You know, literally the same the same thing. Anyway, the Oot, Oot, Oot Brigade are, I suppose we can really see, William the Conqueror is a male version of Margaret Thatcher. They are defeated. And the first of our modern-style coronations takes place in Westminster Abbey. Why does the Abbey assume this significance? The Abbey is built by the last Anglo-Saxon King of England, by Edward the Confessor, St. Edward. Now, I'm afraid when I was doing one of my characteristically naughty appearances with Jacob Rees-Mogg a few days ago, we were discussing future possible saints for England, and people seem to be getting tired of, well, actually, it's only the intelligentsia that's getting tired of poor old St. George. But anyway, and there was the suggestion of St. Edward, and I pointed out that the only reason why Edward the Confessor seems to have been canonized is that he was impotent. That's to say he had no children, which in those days, I mean, remember, Christianity and the more extreme examples of ecology have got rather a lot in common, I'm afraid. The idea that having children is somehow sinful, that you should be preparing yourself for the world up there rather than the world down here. Anyway, Edward, the last Anglo-Saxon king, he dies childless, and William the Conqueror claims that he has left the throne to him, and that equally that Harold has actually sworn to this, and there's a scene of Harold swearing on the Bayeux Tapestry. But what Edward the Confessor had done, he had built Westminster Abbey on Thorney Island. And it's called Westminster because, of course, it's to the east of the city. And the peculiarity from this point onwards is you've got a capital which is sort of bifocal. You've got the city of London to the east, that square mile, which is the commercial capital. It's, of course, anchored around St. Paul's. And you've got the Tower at its far eastern corner. Then you've got the link of the Strand, which those of you who are familiar with London, you'll know follows. The Strand means what? It means the beach. It's the original beaching point for Anglo-Saxon boats, and it's the great curve of the Thames that goes around there. And by the time the Thames has got to Westminster, which is why none of us can work out the geography of it, the Thames is flowing north-south because of the gigantic meander rather than east-west. And on Thorney Island, in that meander, he constructs Westminster Abbey, Westminster, as opposed to the East Church, which is St. Paul's, which is why you rob Peter, the Church of Westminster, to pay Paul, which is St. Paul's. And Edward the Confessor is buried in Westminster Abbey, and from that point onwards, Westminster Abbey becomes the natural crowning place for English kings, because simply the conqueror claims title from him, and from a very early stage, all kings, including the conqueror, again the oath, swear to respect the laws of Edward the Confessor, right? And then all of this, when does the Abbey, of course the Abbey that I'm talking about now would have been a Norman-style building, and it's torn down by King Henry III, who is the son of King John in the middle of the 13th century, and the modern Abbey begins to be built. And what happens at that point is something very extraordinary. You put, I was describing, you've got the Coronation Theatre, the Abbey is specially designed for the coronation. The king will still be crowned on the actual wonderful pavement that was designed for this process. It's called the Cosmati pavement, and it's modelled according to the most extravagant art of Italy at the time. Italian craftsmen were brought over, and if you look at the floor, which you'll actually see, it's normally covered up with carpets because it's so precious, you'll see that it's made out of wonderful coloured marbles. in this extraordinary series of circular patterns, which, if you have a mystical kind of Dan Brown disposition, you read all sorts of nonsense into. But the important thing about them is they're spectacularly beautiful, and they're spectacularly beautiful because they're made from salami slicing ancient Roman columns. So the great columns of Rome that were made out of porphyry and other precious marbles were slit down into half an inch thick and laid in these amazing patterns, and they're there. But equally, what's now completely lost, the Cosmati pavement survives, what's completely lost is that this great crossing area of the abbey, the walls were originally covered in gold mosaic. And those of you who've been to Monreale, in Sicily, it would have looked like Monreale, or on a more modest basis, any of you who've been to the Criterion restaurant in London, which is a very, very good copy of Monreale, and that's largely gone. And how does the abbey work at that point? Well, what you do is you'll see the Cosmati pavement, this great space in the crossing. Then behind it, there's a screen. What is behind the screen is the shrine of St. Edward the Confessor. And then there's a huge horseshoe that goes round there, which are the tombs of all the medieval kings from Henry III up to Henry V at the top. So the abbey is very extraordinary. It's the burial place of the royal saint, the founder saint of the dynasty, Edward. It's the actual final resting place of kings, and it's their coronation place. So in other words, it's the sacred heart of monarchy, and it's sacred also in a very particular way, because from the building of the abbey, from the obvious, you had to disinter poor Edward to move him into his new shrine. And what they do at that point, it would seem to us shocking, but to them seemed natural, they remove his funeral regalia. He would have been buried in royal robes and with a royal crown. They take those off, and from that point until the Civil War, you actually use those robes. So the kings of England then are crowned literally with the vestments of the founder saint of the monarchy. It is this sense of, you think of the Bible, think of Christ in the Bible, the extent to which it's touch. You touch the hem of the robe, the spittle, all of the kiss, all of that. It's the sense of physical contact. And this is exemplified, this is intensified by the coronation service. So you then get this when you build the abbey, and of course the building of it goes on and on and on, and indeed the nave isn't finished. And by the way, we tend to think of the Middle Ages not as having our sort of sense of time or aesthetic sense. They deliberately continue building in the same style. And they only finish it in the reign of Henry VIII. Just before the dissolution of the monasteries, the great abbot, Islip, John Islip, actually finishes it, and he builds the basis of the west front. They don't get the towers done. The towers are only added in the 17th century, but again in the same style. So you've created this extraordinary space, the sacred heart, if you like, of the English monarchy. And all the coronations we're talking about take place there. And basically, the ritual remains, in terms of the sacred aspect of the ritual, it remains essentially what had happened to Dunstan. So the consecration part remains the same. What changes, and changes sharply and violently, and in a way which makes us what we are now, and makes us a term that I want to get all of you into your heads. We are a royal republic. There is an organization that calls itself Republic that trots around saying we can only be free citizens if we get rid of monarchy. This is nonsense. England pioneered all modern political rights. It's as simple as that. Everything that America had is simply a direct transfer of what already existed in England, in Britain, everything that France sought to acquire but manifestly failed to. I offer you an example of President Macron, strutting around like a mini Louis XIV. That all of that again was derived from Britain. So we acquired the republican rights of citizenship whilst being a monarchy. And what I want to argue is we don't do this in the 19th century. This idea was pushed heavily by one of the great commentators on the monarchy, by Walter Bagehot, in his famous essay on the British Constitution, when he says, a republic has enfolded itself in the robes of a monarchy, referring very much to the 19th century. He was generations late. It starts doing it from as early as Magna Carta, but particularly from 1308. Does anybody know what happens in 1308? I'm testing you on your medieval kings. Which king comes to the throne? Edward the Second. Right. Edward the Second. Now, Edward the First is the original strong king. We know he's the original strong king. What's his impact on the coronation that we're going to have? The fact that the Stoon of Scone, or is it the Scone of Stoon, or whatever it is under the coronation chair, that's the result of Edward and his attempted and very nearly successful conquest of Scotland. And I'm afraid still inscribed on his tomb, that's one of the biggest and best of that arc of tombs I was talking about, is Malleus Scotorum, hammer of the Scots. Anyway, we better draw a little veil over that, I suppose. But in the interests of pan-national harmony. So he's the archetypal strong king. His son Edward is the archetypal weak king with a weakness for favourites, and the interpretation, the relations are essentially homosexual, may on, may not be right. It's very difficult to understand these things across the centuries, but certainly people like Piers Gaveston and the Despensers, the younger Despenser, and all the rest of it. And this sense of the weakness of Edward, his proneness to influence, his reluctance to do the serious business of kingship, and the fighting that was an essential part of it, was already clear when he became king. And so what happens in 1308 to that series of clauses that I've described, the first three clauses, you add a fourth, which is quite extraordinary. The king is required to swear to the laws which his people, vulgus, the people, shall have chosen, a future perfect tense. Now, what that means is that you're then reflecting the fact that following Magna Carta, following the struggles around Simon de Montfort, following the struggle between Simon de Montfort and the Lord Edward, the man who becomes Edward I, you've already laid the foundations of Parliament, you've already laid the foundations of this representative assembly, which is the key alongside the monarchy to the nature of our history. And it's very important that we understand the peculiarity of the English Parliament. Remember, we tend to think of the English Parliament as being somehow a kind of new invention that's progressive, that shows, we were cutting edge. This is a complete misunderstanding. Every country in Europe had some form of representative assembly or estates assembly. Most of them die. They're mainly got rid of. Why? Because they're a nuisance. We've all sat in committees, haven't we? And what do? They just talk. They don't do anything. They just get in the way. And so, when you get kings like Louis XIV and whatever who are interested in efficiency, they get rid of representative assemblies. Why does the English Parliament survive? It does because it's not what we think. It's not what the Supreme Court thought it was when it made that absurd judgment on prorogation. The English Parliament is not there to oppose. Why? Because the government sits in Parliament. The government commands, if it's a working government, an automatic majority in the House of Commons. In other words, there's no separation between the legislative and the executive in England. That's why we work. Similarly, Parliament was not created by opposition to weak kings. It was created by strong kings like Edward I. Why? Because they're clever enough to realize if you ask people reasonably politely first, they're much more likely to pay taxes than if you try to rob them at sword point. As you know, in continental Europe, paying tax is still generally regarded as slightly bad manners. In Italy, there's a general sense that, it really is not quite the dumb thing. You should be able to get around this. Whereas we still have this quaint notion, which is expressed as early as the 14th century, that what is decided in Parliament binds everybody because everybody is represented there. Everybody is represented there either in person, if you're a peer or a bishop, or in those days an abbot, or by your representatives, because even then, even in the 13th century, you vote for them. The counties vote and the towns vote, producing burgesses. Now, the electorates are wild by our standards, but there is that process. And so what a king like Edward does, he creates Parliament or lets it develop because it enables him to make law binding and also to make taxation effective. And remember, the other reason that taxation is so important in the Middle Ages is because, and again, we cannot avoid this fact, England is a war monarchy. The English state develops through war. This again is something we do need to acknowledge. Peace only becomes thought of as a good thing after the First World War. Up to that point, peace is regarded as weak, feeble. Kings who believe in peace fail. And instead, what you're supposed to be is very butch and masculine, and everything, whatever the fashion, toxic masculinity, just like President Zelensky. Remember, there's something very peculiar about the fashionable support on the left for President Zelensky, who's some sort of pumped-up muscle man, who enjoys fight. He's complete embodiment. Toxic masculinity. What happens in the Ukraine is men go and fight and women stay at home and look after their children. How shocking. It's not exactly what it's supposed to be, but it is as it was then, right? Yep, sorry. And the English monarchy only functions properly in war. So first, the wars of conquest against, Edward I's wars of conquest against Scotland, and they'd already dealt with Ireland badly. Wars of conquest against Wales, which are successful, Scotland, which are not, and then the vast 100 Years' War against France, which again is repeatedly attached to throughout the succeeding centuries. So Edward II is a king who doesn't match to these standards. And again, let's get this absolutely clear. The other very peculiar thing about the English Parliament is the king sits in it. The king is in Parliament. And still, if you look at an Act of Parliament, any of you have actually read an Act of Parliament, it'd be interesting to know how many of you have, the opening clause is what's called a preamble, which is the waffle about why it's going to happen. And then there is the enacting clause, and the way it goes is, now we've got a king, be it therefore enacted by the king's most excellent majesty, with the advice and consent of the Lords spiritual and temporal, and the commons in this present Parliament assembled that. So the legislative force is still the monarch, and an Act of Parliament does not become law until the monarch has signed it and the signet seal has actually been applied to it. And that's still the case, although no monarch has ever refused consent or been allowed to since the reign of Queen Anne. But that's the legislative force, so the monarch in Parliament. But Edward breaks that oath, and he is held to account. This is the thing we have to understand. The coronation oath in England is taken seriously. It is a contract, because we are a country that very unusually is founded in law and legal process going right back to then. If you break an oath, you pay a price. And the price that Edward pays is dethronement and a horrible death, this is before the watershed. I will not go into the full details. So schoolboys are always very, very fond of them, as they involve a bull's horn and a red-hot poker, and you get the general idea. It is alleged, we do not, another account says that he's simply pressed to death with a table. What you were trying to do was to leave no mark on the body, because the body would have been exhibited more or less naked to show there had not been violence. So that's what we try to do. So he pays this terrible, terrible penalty. He's then succeeded by his son, Edward III, who is the archetype of the strong king, and he goes on, of course, to found something else that we'll see very powerful echoes of in the coronation. He's the founder of the Order of the Garter, at Windsor. He's the reason prime reason St. George, we're talking about him before, is our patron saint, and all the rest of it. And he's, of course, hugely important in the launching and, at first sight, apparently the winning of the 100 Years' War, because he actually captures his son, the Black Prince, actually captures King John of France and brings him here as a hostage for the payment of a gigantic ransom. But then he's succeeded by his grandson, because the Black Prince dies before his father. His father, by the way, is the first king to reign 50 years. And he's the first king to have a jubilee. It's a bit really rather like the Queen with her platinum jubilee. He dies immediately afterwards, presumably after exhaustion and excitement. But anyway, and he's then succeeded by his grandson, Richard II, who again is of the same type as Edward. Not there's any suggestion of the sexual perversion or whatever, but he is a king who believes on the one hand in the absolute mystery and magic of monarchy, and on the other refuses the notion that he must submit himself to legal process. And many of you will be familiar, I was standing in front of it only a week or two ago in the National Gallery, the wonderful Wilton diptych portrait of Richard, which shows him, diptych means two leaves. It shows him on one side kneeling in magnificent golden robes, very finely chiseled face and whatever, and behind him are two royal saints and John the Baptist. And the important thing to understand is the date of Richard's birthday. Richard is born on the Feast of the Epiphany. He's born on the 6th of January. And the Feast of the Epiphany, again, this extraordinary assimilation of monarchy to God, to Jesus, whatever. The king, on the Feast of the Epiphany, performed all the rituals of the Magi. And it still goes on in a very remote and dilute form in St. James's Palace. Still in St. James's Palace, a gentleman usher will offer up gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And you did the whole lot in the Middle Ages. The king himself did it. And what you see then are three kings in that. You've got Richard himself, you've got one of his patrons, who is clearly Edward the Confessor, and then his other is a king who is a martyred king, St. Edmund, the king of the East Angles, who was shot together. He has a St. Sebastian. He's shot with arrows by the Vikings, and then has his head cut off just to make sure. So he's another royal saint, and St. John the Baptist is there. Because, of course, originally the 6th of January is the day on which Christ is christened. It's then shifted to the 7th of January to avoid having too many important feasts on the same day. So St. John the Baptist is there. And then on the other side, you have whom Richard is worshipping, which is the Christ child and the Virgin, and these magnificent blue robes. It's amazing. Deep blue, which is actually made, we were talking of precious stones, it's made out of lapis lazuli, ground lapis, so this incredible in gum, this incredible, and heavy gilt, this incredible sort of colour thing, and the angels of heaven, and one of them holding the standard of St. George, the flag of St. George, with the orb which Richard had put in his hand when he's crowned, but the orb there showing a reflection of England. It's astonishing. But if you then look carefully at the angels, you see there's something very peculiar about them. They're all wearing what look like lace collars, and they've got badges of the White Hart dangling from them. Then if you look across, you see Richard is wearing exactly the same collar, a collar of peace cods, or broom's cod. And as you all know, the name of the house of Plantagenet is from the broom plant. So he's wearing a collar of gold, you know the pod, like a pea pod of the broom plant. It explodes and you see the little things, you see the little seeds inside. These are represented in gold, and then there is his badge of the White Hart. What is this? Well, I'm afraid the best way of thinking of it is these are the emblems of football supporters. That by the time you got to this period of the Middle Ages, the great nobility, of course, had been leading. There was no standing army. The king's army was put together out of the members of his household and knightly following, and the households and the servants of the other great lords. And to distinguish themselves, they all give themselves these collars and badges. And it's called, in the term of art in history, it's called bastard feudalism. And of course, it's all very well when you're fighting the French. But when you stop fighting the French and come home, what you do, like football supporters, you fight each other. And that's exactly what happened, and law and order begins to disintegrate. And there were two ways that the king could deal with this. One was he could try to ban it. Richard sort of pretends to try to ban it, but the other, and I'm afraid this is a Starkey formulation, you could make yourself, remember it's called bastard feudalism, you could make yourself the biggest bastard feudal lord of them all. And that is exactly what Richard goes about doing. He goes about monopolizing this process, acquiring huge quantities of land, followers, mainly based in Cheshire. Remember, the king is still Earl of Chester, and vast landing holdings there, huge castle, part of its content seized from the Earl of Arundel, huge fortune, and he has the Cheshire archers, who are his thugs, which wear exactly the same badge as those angels. So what Richard has done, he's recruited the heavenly host alongside his thugs to make sure that his monarchy is protected on high and very, very much below, and it doesn't work. And in 1399, he goes exactly the same way as Richard, as Edward II, with again the same charge that he's broken his coronation oath, that he said that the laws were in his own mouth. So what we've got to understand, we have this very, very long political tradition, and this will sound, I hope, shocking, talking about the coronation of the forthcoming king, of getting rid of bad kings. We tend to think it's the French who did it. They're very slow learners. We embarked on this process at a very, very early stage. And I think it's, dare I say, I think it's something to be profoundly proud of. Because what it meant was that monarchy was controlled. It meant that monarchy had to subject to the general interest as represented by a broad representative assembly. Now, of course, the story then complicates itself in my own period. When I'm standing in a place like this down in Kent, I'm normally talking about Henry VIII. And many of you will be wondering how on earth a king like Henry VIII fits into this pattern of relatively restrained monarchy. And the answer is he actually does, in a surprising way, because everything that Henry does is done by Act of Parliament. Henry is like Boris Johnson and Cummings. In fact, I think the behaviour of Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson and Carrie Johnson was exactly like that of Henry VIII, Thomas Cromwell, and Anne Boleyn. It was with Carrie fulfilling the role of Anne Boleyn, of Dominic Cummings. It's questioned whether he's called Dom or Tom, and Boris Johnson with much the same kind of manners with ladies as Henry VIII. Functioning between these two figures, and they manipulate Parliament because Parliament can be managed. Parliament should be managed. So that gigantic break with Rome, which confiscated the monasteries, seized these vast quantities of land, introduced monstrous laws over treason, was done with full parliamentary consent. The law was never broken. Ever broken. And the thing that's even more surprising, and it's very, very surprising, is that everybody's property right was respected apart from the church. So when the monasteries are dissolved, everybody who was a creditor, anybody who'd entered into a deal over sheep, sheep farming or future purchase of crops and whatever, was respected in the most minute legal detail. And indeed, providing they went along with it, the monks and whatever were paid generous pensions. It was, in other words, it was done, and this is what's so terrifying about it, it was done with formal respect to law. Not with respect to justice, but respect to legal procedure. And, okay, legal procedure isn't an absolute protection for obvious reasons. It allowed what happened under Henry, but it's much better than merely arbitrary government. Everybody says, Henry VIII ordered somebody to be executed. He couldn't. They had to be tried. On the other hand, Henry knew that he'd broken that clause of his coronation oath, which said he will keep the peace between church and people. And he actually clearly envisaged a second coronation. I was up in York the day before yesterday filming it, where it would have been in York Minster. And he even revised his coronation oath to conveniently absolve him from all the breaches that he'd made in his first oath, but it's never actually used. So yes, you get these shifts. But the big message, of course, that you take from that point onwards is that suddenly England divides itself religiously. Henry is succeeded by his 3 children, each one of whom assumes a different religious position, and religious division becomes deeply embedded in the country. And again, it's very important we realize this. Henry makes himself supreme head of the church. And again, I've lectured about this a lot down here. We should take those words literally. Henry's full title, and if you go to Hever, I'm plugging it now heavily because I'm actually their historical advisor. We've now uncovered the frame of a magnificent portrait of Henry, which we were increasingly convinced is School of Holbein. We now know that Holbein actually had a studio, which we didn't used to think of before. But what's astonishing about this picture, it still keeps its original frame, buried within a 19th century frame, and on it is inscribed Henry's full title, which is Supreme Head of the Church of England and of Ireland, only upon earth, only under Christ. There is that sense of the absoluteness of royal power, and each monarch from that point onwards, going right to the end of the 17th century, each succeeding monarch changes religion from that point onwards, as supreme head of the church. So Edward takes it towards a Protestant direction. Mary takes it right back to rigorous Catholicism. Elizabeth, a slightly compromised. The only monarch who doesn't change things is James I, because he's so relieved to be in a country that takes kings seriously, unlike Scotland. When he was in Scotland, he sat down here whilst dreadful people, Knox is dead, thank heavens, but people like George Buchanan thundered at him as God's silly vessel. When he comes to England, he sits. Do you remember the Chapel Royal at St. James's with that wonderful dress circle gallery where the monarch sits and the preacher's down there and the king looks down there and the preacher looks up there, yearning to be made a bishop, and it's a wonderful way by which you control your church. Anyway, Charles I takes, James's son, takes all that a bit too seriously, and again, an extraordinary coronation, which is, as you would expect, here is a king who takes religious ceremony profoundly seriously. And by the way, the reason that you're able still to do this is a series of extraordinary chances. Although England has become radically Protestant, at least formally radically Protestant, the text of the coronation service only goes into English for James I, because Elizabeth is crowned according to the old Catholic rite. And by the time you've got to James I, you have a king who's very, very aware of the sanctity of monarchy. And indeed, any of you who are legally qualified and interested, the entire Stuart succession is illegal. Henry VIII has excluded the Stuarts by his will, and the will is not repealed because it's backed by Act of Parliament. It's so English, and the Privy Council looks at it, says it's very difficult, orders a very large chest with 2 keys, loses the keys, and puts it in an obscure and very damp corner of the Treasury, where it moulders away until it's rediscovered in the 19th century. Very, very typically English. But James succeeds illegally and knows it, and therefore sees it as being an act of indefeasible hereditary right. So Charles then, and again, you'd had extraordinary figures like the Dean of Westminster Abbey. Obviously, the Abbey's gone, but it's run by the Dean then as now, and you have Dean Goodman, who is fascinated by clerical vestments, although, of course, the Elizabethan Church disapproved of them, wanted to remove them. He loves them. That also happens at Canterbury, by the way. It's why the cathedral still preserves so much of its glass, still preserves so much of the beauty of the Middle Ages, that you have it's Dean Wootton there, who is, and you'll see there's a wonderful image of him in Canterbury Cathedral, and you cannot tell the difference between that and a Catholic priest. If you remember, he's actually praying at a prie-dieu. He's in white vestments bordered in gold. He could be in any continental cathedral. But in Westminster Abbey, you keep all the vestments. You keep all of this stuff. All the St. Edward's stuff is still kept. You still continue. For a Protestant monarchy to anoint, to invoke saints like Edward, and it's completely, logically bewildering. But it continues, and Charles I takes this with desperate seriousness. And his coronation before the 20th century is one of the best organized, the most polished. You have the future Archbishop Laud acting as master, cruelly called Master of Ecclesiastical Ceremonies. And we also have his annotated book, in which he actually notes what the king does with everything. And the peculiar thing, I mentioned the Edward regalia. Normally, of course, these things are fragile, they're precious. They're just touched symbolically against the king. Charles I insists on shoving his feet into the sandals. When the oil is poured, when the oil of unction is poured on his head, there's an Anglo-Saxon comb. He reaches and sort of, more or less a mirror's held up to him as he does his hair. There's long, luscious curls that he's got. Does his hair back again, and of course he takes. He introduces a new element into his oath, in which his oath to obey the laws is subject to the idea of a prerogative, to a special personal power in the king, and you get the terrible clash with Parliament, which leads to the horrors of our most sustained civil war, and to the terrible moment in 1649 when the king is tried and is executed in front of his own palace, in front of the Palace of Whitehall, and his head is held up. And at that point, remember, we go much, much further than the French. Every single element of monarchy is destroyed. The French, although they do terrible things in 1791, you've already developed a historic sense. So in 1791, things like the great medieval regalia of Charlemagne and whatever is regarded as being historically important. You're creating great museums, so you keep it. We, in 1649, we destroy everything. There is a determined attempt at removing the word king from the language. Not a single item of that magnificent medieval regalia that I've described survives apart from the tiny spoon that's used to do the anointing, and that survives because it's a souvenir and it's dirt cheap. Whereas the great crowns with their jewels and gold and whatever, everything is broken up. The king's goods are sold, his magnificent collection of paintings get the lot. And then you discover you can't do without a king, because if you don't have a king, you have a military dictator. You've got Oliver Cromwell, and increasingly, Oliver Cromwell adopts royal routine. The title of Lord Protector, we don't really understand it. The title of Lord Protector actually means regent. And he's inaugurated twice. In the second inauguration in Westminster Hall, he uses the coronation chair. He is invested with a purple robe. He's given a sword, a gold Bible, and a scepter. Right? And then when he's buried, he's actually buried with the crown. You have if you remember that extraordinary moment at the Queen's funeral when the crown is on the coffin, Right. That is the final echo of the medieval tradition, that on top of the coffin of the monarch, throughout the Middle Ages, right up to the 17th century, there was an image. There was actually of the monarch fully, is why there is, for example, the wonderful death mask of Henry VII survives, because it was a lifelike image that was put on top of the coffin with all the royal robes, the crowns, the jewels on the fingers and all the rest of it. And it's only removed at the moment that the body is going to be buried. So it's a kind of, as it was with the Queen's funeral, you felt at that moment when the crown came off, that was a moment she ceased to be queen. And it was just a human body that was going to go down there. And it's exactly that same symbolism. And with Cromwell, he is, the image of him at his funeral has got the imperial crown. Even more strikingly, his later coinage shows him as a Roman emperor. Cromwell's role is very much like that of a Roman emperor. The Roman emperors, where you say imperator means general, and they controlled the army. And it's the first time and the last time, thank God, that we've been run by an army, which is what it was under Cromwell. But his final coinage of 1656 is astonishing. It shows him in profile, obviously hugely forceful face, with the laurel wreath on his head, and then the full Latin inscription, Olivarius, by the grace of God. Of the Republic again. Republica, RP, of England, Scotland, and Ireland, protector, protected by the grace of this extraordinary inscription. So when you bring back Charles I, and this is really important, because bring back Charles II rather, because the power of kings is limited. The power of a military protector was unlimited. And this is something, again, we really do need to understand. We are the only country to have reversed a revolution. To have decided, and again, as this seductive notion of radical change, of revolution, is being dangled under our noses, revolutions always fail. They always make things worse. The horrors of France, why France can't establish a legitimate government. Do you know how many constitutions it's had since the revolution? Well, how many republics are we on? 5. Then you add to that 2 monarchies and 2 empires. 9 constitutions in 200 years, and you're still looking at what's going on with Macron. Russia, China, revolutions only made the preceding regimes worse. The only revolution that's successful is the American Revolution, because it really isn't a revolution. All you do is reproduce England. Seriously, if you look at it, do you know what the administrative officer of the House of Representatives is called? The Sergeant at Arms, because he's the Sergeant at Arms in England, and it's run by the Speaker. It is time, and the Senate has exactly the same powers as the House of Lords. And the president is really George III without his wig, except then, of course, Donald Trump sort of rather, indeed Reagan to a point, got us around that one. So what happens then in the Glorious Revolution, what happens in 1660, is this deliberate reversal of the revolution and the bringing back of a monarchy as a limited, legal, legitimate form of government. But then, of course, you get another King James II who won't recognize that. And in an event which I think we've never fully recognized the importance of, the Glorious Revolution, that's the one that sorts all these problems out. You get rid of James, I'm afraid, because it was quite clear that James's Catholicism was very much a part of his belief in absolutism. You exclude Catholics, which is, of course, one of the reasons that 1688 was not celebrated in 1988, 1999. There's a very bad-tempered debate in the Lords on the subject. But we should recognize what was done in 1688-89 when William and Mary, that's James's daughter, by his first marriage to Anne Hyde, when they're brought and made king and queen, all the problems that I'm talking about are settled definitively. You establish particularly what the coronation oath shall be. The monarch is required from 1689 onwards to obey the laws as established by parliamentary statute. That's what you pin it down. Now, you will all remember, I hope, that something very odd is going on with the coronation of Charles III. He said he's not particularly interested in having members of Parliament there. And I think this is something quite extraordinary. I mean, if you go back to the coronation of William and Mary, the entire House of Commons has a special gallery built for it, complete with the speaker overlooking the coronation theatre. So, they're looking down to make sure the king is swearing that oath, and the Bill of Rights and everything establish all the modern powers of Parliament. Of course, the problem with that is, if you cast your mind back to what I was saying about the origins of Parliament, Parliament has to be managed. If you give Parliament these forceful powers against the king, who's going to manage it? Normally, you get what happens with the various French parliamentary republics. You get a standoff between the two. We are cleverer. We invent the office of Prime Minister. And the purpose of the Prime Minister is to manage the king on behalf of Parliament and to manage Parliament on behalf of the king, using all the dirty methods that we affect to disapprove of. So you need to use bribery, you need to use honours, you need to use the threat of demotion, the promise of promotion, because that's the only way you can control a legislative assembly. And that's why our system of government has worked. And the premier is this strange, there are really two kings. All the powers of the monarch are exercised by the prime minister, which means from this point onwards, of course, the monarchy becomes something very different. Why do we keep it? Well, the answer is provided by the greatest of English political theorists and writers, Edmund Burke, who is happily completely untheoretical, though he's the greatest English political theorist, in his responses to the horrors of the French Revolution. In that wonderful text, his Reflections on the Revolution in France, it's an amazing piece of prophecy. It's written as early as 1790, as the actual when all that's happened is the capture of the king in Versailles and is taken to Paris. He predicts everything. He predicts the execution of the king. He predicts the rise of Napoleon. He predicts the terror, the lot. But what he does, he offers the explanation of why you need monarchy. This is where we're coming now into our own period and coming into our own century. He recognizes that republican government is a faceless and ordinary, in our sense of the word, a faceless and rootless thing. That what you need in order to have that sense of loyalty and affection, that he actually uses the word love. Remember, he has this wonderful phrase: we can only love our country if our country is lovely. It's it's a profoundly emotional statement. And I think that we have disregarded much too much this question of emotion. And what he's saying is, you need, as it were, the public face of government has to be embodied in an individual. Government is not, as the French revolutionaries thought, and even the American revolutionaries, when they're being Jeffersonian and silly, it's not an invention of the moment. Why do we have these freedoms that I'm talking about? Because they're inherited. We didn't invent them. Over hundreds and hundreds of years, this is worked out and entrenched. And in a sense, hereditary monarchy acts as a symbol of that continuity, of that wonderful statement at the time of the Glorious Revolution that the laws are our birthright. They're a thing, we didn't create them. We inherited them. Our duty is to preserve them, improve them, and to hand them on. But then, of course, you then begin to ask the question, which it's clear is very much troubling King Charles, what happens with this when in the beginning of the late 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, you actually have genuine democracy? Now remember, I've been giving you a picture of England in which you have responsible, legally rooted, limited government going back to the Middle Ages. But it's not democracy. In other words, only a tiny majority of people actually have the vote. But what's peculiar about England, if you look at every other European country, in order to bring about democracy, you had to have revolution. You had to break the preceding structures of aristocratic and royal government. England is completely different. What were the Chartists campaigning for in the 1830s? the vote. What were women campaigning for in the 1900s and the 1920s? The vote. In other words, the notion that you didn't want to destroy Parliament, you wanted to get into it. You wanted to have the vote in Parliament. And that begins to be given, and by the way, it is worth bearing in mind how paradoxically it seems, it's worth emphasizing that the decisive step to giving the vote to the working man is taken by a Conservative Prime Minister. It's taken by Disraeli in 1867, and it's only at that moment that you start to get built-in Conservative majorities, because as we've seen now, the smart, educated middle class are fundamentally lefties. Disraeli is smart enough to understand. Disraeli is a kind of intellectual version of Nigel Farage. He's smart enough. He's smart, or indeed Boris Johnson, and his coalition of the Tory party is very much like that of 2019, and he's smart enough to understand that. But where does that leave monarchy? And what's astonishing is everything that we will see on May the 6th is the creation of the first decade of the 20th century in response to the idea that monarchy has now got to perform to a mass democracy that's used to wonderful theatre, that's used to increasing prosperity and whatever. So do we all realize that, I'm talking about the theatre in Westminster Abbey, but there's another theatre, isn't there, which is the front of Buckingham Palace, the great roundabout, the Mall, Admiralty Arch, which will provide the setting for all of this. Do you realise it's built in 6 years in the reign of Edward VII? As a monument to Victoria. And the whole thing is designed by this extraordinary man, Reginald Brett, Viscount Esher, whose mother is French, and he's passionately aware of the risk of revolution. And he sees this kind of monarchy that I'm talking about, a monarchy which displays itself through ceremony which is deliberately historically grounded and persuades and flatters and involves. And the particular thing that he was most proud of is the huge roundabout in front of Buckingham Palace. That is created by, the ground falls away very steeply there, and it's built up. It's this enormous structure. What's it there for? Adoration. So the balcony in the middle and this vast theatre in front of it. And royal ceremony at this point changes completely. We didn't do ceremony well. We did in the Middle Ages, but we didn't in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Victoria's coronation is magnificent, but it's complete shambles. They're done with no rehearsal at all. So the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's anyway gaga, begins without his spectacles and with his book upside down. The Victoria's ring has been specially made, but they've measured the wrong finger. And unfortunately, they measured the little finger, not the fourth finger. She describes the agony as this sort of senile old archbishop thrust the thing on. And then when it came to the homage, in those days it's performed by the whole of the nobility. One of the peers performing it was called Baron Roll, and he was a kind of backwoods nobleman. And he sort of takes the steps of the throne at a charge with bits of ermine and mothballs and old rats and whatever flying out, and he trips and rolls back down. Now remember that this is 1837. They're not Victorian, they're still Regency. If something like that happens, it'd be really rather nice if it did, wouldn't it? Don't tell anybody. On May the 6th, they'll be we'd all die of embarrassment. What they do, of course, huge cheers break out. And being a plucky old peer, he gets up and takes them again. He does exactly the same thing, at which point they open a book. They're taking bets as to whether he'll do it. And on the third attempt, he's got to be rescued by Victoria and her ladies. And then, of course, again, the wonderful satirical gifts of the English. All the foreign observers are told, you may have seen there's a thing called the Court of Claims, in which you claim to do various things at the coronation. If you're the Lord of the Manor of Worksop, you're presenting with goods and whatever. And it's claimed that he holds the barony of Roll by the right of rolling 3 times down the steps. And whatever. So it's complete shambles. But what you do from the beginning of the 20th century, you produce these perfect ceremonies, the design for popular consumption. And it becomes the ceremony that we do so well. But things are lost as you do it. And there are two things that I want to end on, and then we can pick up everything else with questions. The first of them is that with 1931, with the Statute of Westminster, which recognises the semi-independent existence of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and all the rest of it, you actually change the coronation oath. So that oath which specified that the monarch must swear to the laws in Parliament is abandoned, totally illegally. The act is not repealed, and instead the monarch swears that as king of, everything for those days, including Ceylon, with the Queen, you will govern them according to their respective laws and customs. I think it is high time we brought back that notion of Parliament, and because one of the things that is disastrous, it seems to me, is the contempt in which we now hold our institutions. This is disastrous. We have to do something about it. And the second thing is, of course, that the coronations of the middle years of the 20th century also involved another idea of monarchy. This is very much the invention of the House of Windsor in 1917 in response to the Russian Revolution. It is that the monarchy is the ideal British family, and that you never, ever get divorced. Which is why the terrible fate of Edward VIII, kicked off the throne, poor old Princess Margaret, reduced to what Anthony Armstrong-Jones had the most wonderful way of describing it. What was that in the West? It was called mistake, wasn't it? Yes, being sent off to mistake and whatever. And of course, this is where I think I'm really rather in favour of what Charles has done. This new coronation will see, on the other hand, the elevation of divorce into the norm, and it will see the idea of a mixed family, this blended family, in which I think, as far as I can see, Parker Bowles will be at least as prominent as members of the House of Windsor. And on that note, perhaps I'd better stop and let myself be limited by your questions. Thank you.